so when I approach this issue and I speak on this, I often just ask people, okay, why? Can you tell me, why do you identify the way that you do? And this is where I think my research that I've done on the causes of gender dysphoria, being whether it's in group, whether it is rigid gender stereotypes, or whether it is a dislike of what someone sees of their own anatomy, a discomfort with their body, that these sort of views that lead to gender dysphoria, I want to say, I think that's the problem, not your biology. And so I would just propose a different way to try to find congruence and healing than to do biological transitioning.
So, what, I don't know if you've thought on this or not, but what would your solution be to somebody with gender dysphoria?
Yeah, and so this is where I'm happy to say that it's easy in a sense. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have to have those difficult questions about it. But what I have found is this: in the people that I've come into contact with, people with genuine gender dysphoria that I've had conversations with, overwhelmingly, not always, overwhelmingly, I've had a positive response of not telling them that they're wrong or they're sinful, nothing of that nature, of just saying, okay, here's how culture presents this. Here's how a Christian worldview presents this. What do you think? And I just ask some questions like, okay, tell me your story. What led to your gender dysphoria? Why is it that you identify the way that you do? And overwhelmingly, at least in my experience, and I know this is not true of everybody, but overwhelmingly in my experience, it has come, the vast majority of answers has come down to rigid gender stereotypes. It's because some days I just don't feel girly, and therefore I must be non-binary. Or there are days in which there's sometimes I don't like girl activities, or I don't like pink, or I don't like this. I had one girl tell me, I like playing in the mud and chopping down trees. I just like boy stuff, so I think I'm a boy. And so my pushback is, okay, but these are stereotypes that we recognize are socially constructed stereotypes. Why are you allowing socially constructed stereotypes to determine your gender identity that is leading to dysphoria? And I have found, at least in my personal experience, in really sitting down and nuancing this and walking through this, to cause someone, because again, my presupposition is that our bodies are what is accurate, how God created us to be, and therefore there is a disconnect with how we view ourselves. And so to get someone to just stop and think for a moment why they view themselves the way they do has been helpful. Now, I recognize there's a much, much deeper psychological and a component to it that psychologists will walk through when it comes to different experiences and all that kind of stuff. But that's how I would kind of say the solution is to, I think, sometimes push back against the cultural narrative. And where I have found benefit of just questioning, okay, so when you say that you're a woman trapped in a man's body, what is a woman? What are you feeling that makes you identify as a woman? And walking through that with the individual and recognizing that feeling they get is often based on socially constructed gender stereotypes that should not be determinative of our gender identity. Or it is a discomfort with what they see. They look in a mirror, they have body, they have a view of their body that is different, or they don't like the way that they develop. I talked to one individual that as soon as she went through puberty, she didn't like seeing her body that developed the way it was, and therefore wouldn't identify as a boy because she hated what she saw. And this is a very common issue with a lot of people where they have body image issues, where they don't like certain characteristics of their body. And that's where I will sometimes say, like, we don't have to love every single thing about us, but we're at least called to not hate what God says is good. And so my solution that I have done from a theological perspective is to just question or ask questions about the cultural narrative to say, okay, where does this identity come from, and how did you arrive at that conclusion? And to where that is what is determinative of your true self rather than the biological makeup. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. It's off of that. Um, sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
You're good.
Yeah. So with the question Okay, so something we had talked about before when we had talked about this a couple months ago, you were saying that it gets dangerous. Oh, hang on, sorry.
No problem. 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah.
So something we had talked about is you had said that when we separate gender from sex, it gets dangerous because we get into stereotypes, and that's how we define all that. Um, and I really thought about that a lot. Was one of the things that stuck out to me the most from that conversation. Um, but really, at the end of the day, that's what it is. Gender and sex are separated, and it is the stereotypes that define the gender. And for an example, and I won't get into the graphic details of why this person had this happen to them, but it was a boy. His circumcision went wrong when he was very young, and a doctor raised him as a girl. It was like a
Yeah.
study to see if they could raise him as a female, and he'd end up female. Have you heard this one before?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
But
so
if you want
he
to share,
grows up and ended
yeah.
up saying, and he's saying that he grows up and he didn't like any of the female things. He felt more like he should be shaving instead of wearing a dress, things like that. And so he ended up retransitioning or detransitioning back to the male gender after his parents had transitioned him to a female because of that accident. And so I say all that to ask if somebody, because that's what gender dysphoria is, feel more comfortable in these stereotypes as opposed to what most people define. So as long as they're not trying to change their sex and they're just trying to change the idea that, well, I fit these stereotypes more and feel more comfortable as this, then I don't really see a problem with that. But I'm sure you probably do, and I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So I think with that story, I think the one thing that shows is I think that gender is not just merely socially constructed. I mean, their whole experiment was he was born biologically male. And if we just don't tell him he was and just act like he's been a female and treat him as a female his whole life, then we'll just raise him as a female because there really is no innate connection of gender with biological sex. The problem is that this individual was raised as a female and recognized there's something wrong here. And it wasn't really, there was a detransition in a sense, but it was a realignment back with true biology. And so I think that that it sometimes actually can be shown or used to show that there is an innate connection between biological sex and gender expression, where this individual felt a disconnect because we thought, hey, merely socially constructed, raise him as a girl and he'll be perfectly fine. And he wasn't. And so I think that's a deeper question there of just what I talked about during the previous section is like, is gender identity anything innate? Is it purely socially constructed? Is it only psychological? I think stories like that show that there is a biological component to it. Now, as far as a theological view, I would argue that God has created us to do and live and act in a way that is true, and to have a true representation of all things, including ourselves. And so that's where there's the passage in Deuteronomy that talks about men not wearing women's clothing and women not wearing men's clothing. And one transgender advocate argued like, oh, see, now all men have to wear shorts and a t-shirt and all women have to wear dresses. No, that's not true. Because there's still culturally constructed, gender stereotypes of what certain gender expressions are, where in America, yeah, guys can wear, shorts and t-shirt or whatever, but you go somewhere else in, different African, communities, and men wear actually dresses or whatever, they want to call them. And so the question is, and I think the proper interpretation of that passage, when you look at different, the context, is to say, we are supposed to present ourselves in a way that represents ourselves truly. And so if gender expression is inherently connected to biological sex, which is what this book argues for, and I think that you can make a biblical case for, then to present myself in a way that is disconnected from my biological sex would be a way to present myself that is not true to who I am, and therefore would be a misrepresentation of who I am, and therefore be something that is problematic within a Christian understanding. So that would be at least my reason for why I think that we should do our best to understand who God has created us to be, and then live in a way that is consistent within that, recognizing that there are gender stereotypes that do build into how we express ourselves to where other people see ourselves for who we are truly.
Yeah. On that, like for me, it'd be kind of crazy for me to transition at this stage because my mind understands I'm a guy. That's how I feel. I've always lined up with my biological sex, never once doubted that. But people with gender dysphoria, obviously they do doubt that. And I think some people, it surely is pushed by culture and whatnot, where they're like, oh, maybe I'm not. But some people, they really are born where their mind has this disconnect from their biological sex to where they feel like they need to transition. And some of them, they end up, you see results where they ended up a lot better after. And obviously, like we've said before, happiness doesn't have anything to do with what's morally right or wrong necessarily. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's an important, I think you just raised an important point. I know that when we talked a few months back, I shared with you some of the recent studies that were just published in like February or March, that one of the most expansive studies actually shows that there's not this really massive increase in happiness and goodness. And actually it showed the opposite, that there was a greater depression, greater anxiety after transitioning. But as you mentioned, I think that is slightly beside the point in the fact that just because something makes us happy doesn't mean that it's good. There's a lot of things that make us happy that we recognize we shouldn't do. And so the deeper question is what should I do? And hopefully in a way that when things are oriented properly, things that are good should make us happy, and things that are bad should make us, should cause harm. But that's not always the immediate effect.